Welcome back, everybody, to Conspirinormal.
Adam, what number is this? What number episode?
499. So that means episode 500 is coming up here pretty quickly. And I'm going to be in the planning stages of that as we're recording this. Expect probably in the next month or so to see a multi-part episode 500. So I'll keep everybody posted as time moves on. But for episode number 499, we have someone that I feel needs no introduction. Has actually started his own podcast now and has been on the show at least 3 or 4 times, I think. And that's Dr. Richard Spence. Dr. Spence, welcome back to Conspirinormal.
Welcome back.
Hi, it's my pleasure to be back.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming back on. You were on Lex Friedman not that long ago, which was I enjoyed listening to that show. That was really cool. How did that come about?
He emailed me and said, "Oh, I do this podcast. I want to fly you down to Austin to be on it." And I have to admit that up to that point, I really didn't know who Lex Friedman was. That's apparently how fringe culture I am. And apparently it's kind of a big deal. Anyway, it was interesting. But he was, so what was Lex Friedman like? He was very nice. Couldn't ask for a better host.
That was a cool episode. And of course, I followed you, these episodes that you did for, well, at the time was Wondrium, and now it's Great Courses again. I don't quite know how that happened, but those are very worth watching. The one about the occult, and then the other one about the conspiracies and cover-ups. And now you have your own podcast called Strange as It Seems, and I've been listening to it, and it's really just like a tour de force into like a lot of the strange conspiracy and I guess parapolitical and all these type of things that we talked about on this show. And we talked about some of the subjects on this show too, with you and with others. But how did this come about, doing this podcast?
Well, my partner in that is a guy by the name of Stephen Austin, and he's a history grad student at University of Idaho. And he actually wasn't one when I was there, but we sort of met. We have both common interests in history. And, we would get together and sit around and have a beer or two and talk about these kinds of things. And, along with sometimes alarming people at nearby tables who actually heard what we were talking about, when they hear you mention human sacrifice or Satanism.
Everybody turned their head at the Applebee's and was like, what's going on?
Yeah, what are they doing over there? But we just thought, well, maybe we should, add a tiny bit more structure to this and, just and do a podcast, because it's apparently the destiny of everyone on Earth to at some point have a podcast. I have my reservations about that, but it's been fun. And that's the main reason that we're doing it. I would ask anybody, you can check it out on YouTube. I think to find it on YouTube, you have to do Strange as It Seems and then add my name Spence to it, and it will come up. Otherwise, you get things that aren't connected to it. And so we have 7 episodes out. It's also on Spotify, for whatever that's worth. And then we have an 8th one coming out, which may be my favorite so far, called Flying Saucers and Secret Agents. So you'd have to watch that to figure out what goes on. But anyway, if anyone is interested, check it out, and don't say bad things. If you do, okay, shame on you. And hopefully subscribe. I have to make all the YouTube boys, because that's apparently the purpose in these things. I have to do that now. I have become a slave to the algorithm. So there we are.
Yeah, I hear you.
We all are.
You cover the Utah airship mystery. Of course, James Selby Downer, you have an episode about that, which we talked about pretty extensively on this show with you. Aleister Crowley, connections to, his spy work, and Fred Krisman, which we did an episode with the guy Brian Shickley, who did the like cartoon, like the animated thing. Yeah, he actually lives rather close to Surfiel. Jack Parsons, and then something I want to talk about a little later on with you, Clotilde Bresson, which is something actually, when I listened to that like a couple of days ago, I had never had even heard of this book. And in fact, when I tried to look up stuff about it online, there's no English Wikipedia article about it. It's just like
I don't think the book has ever been translated into English.
So have you read it in the original French?
I've tried to go through parts of it in French, trying to figure out what people actually said. My French isn't that good, but with the help of Google Translate, I could do it. And there are some pretty good English synopses of what the book is about. But yeah, I think you could probably, if you were really good at reading French, could notice things that haven't been noticed before.
There's so much in French. After the revolution, all the genesis of so much conspiracy culture nowadays, it's so much in French. Every time like I find a new source and I'm like, damn it, I have no French at all.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff has been, I mean, the language standard around the world now, for better or for worse, is English. And that's sort of become the closest thing to Esperanto. It became what Esperanto never did. But there is always, you always have to keep in mind, a very big literature. There's like a whole, think of it this way, dark web, although it's not the dark web of literature, in French, German, Russian. There's huge, vast amount of material, Russian research material, historical and otherwise. And, Turkish for that matter, Hindi, Urdu, Chinese. Imagine how much stuff there is available in Chinese that has never been translated. Japanese as well. So in terms of looking at things that are available only in English, it's, we probably have the better part of it in some way, but it's not everything by a long shot.
Maybe that is something AI can do for us.
So when you said Russian, that kind of jogged my memory about something I was reading today. There's this thing called the Hoover Institution.
Yes.
And they actually, it was actually started by Herbert Hoover. But one of the things that they apparently have in their possession is all the files of the Okhrana, like the Tsarist secret police.
Well, they've got the files of the Paris office of the Okhrana. They don't have the main files, but the Okhrana was the Tsarist secret police. Its main mission was to keep track and combat revolutionary movements. It did other stuff, but its main mission was to combat revolutionaries. And since Paris was the headquarters of Russian emigres, so when political dissidents fled Tsarist Russia, a lot of them ended up in Paris. I mean, before the revolution, there were 30,000 Russians living in Paris, and the bulk of them were political refugees. So the Okhrana, the Tsarist secret police, had its main foreign station in Paris. And then the other European stations and elsewhere, like those in London, those in New York, those in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Not kidding you. They had an agent there. Those people basically reported to the Paris office. So the Paris office has all the communiques going back and forth with the headquarters in St. Petersburg. And yeah, they just don't. They lifted the file cabinet, the actual file cabinet with the file cards in the file cabinet. They're sitting down in one of the Hoover Institution's basements. I was privileged to once see it. I was taken down to the elevator into the Holy of Holies. And
did you get to look? Did you get to look through it?
Yeah.
Do you speak Russian?
That's so. Read it pretty well, and that was what I focused my attention on. And it was interesting because that's what happens when archivists know you, and when you've hung around there enough, you become kind of familiar, and they're bored, and then they'll take, yeah, here it is.
Did you use any of that stuff in your book?
Yeah, that figured well into the book on Sidney Riley for the most part, and also the one on Boris Savinkov was that as well. So I could see, and it's a think of it this way: it's like a 3x5 dimension, a 3x5 card index by name, and you simply go through and you look for the person you want, and they will have the whole series of cards about where they were, and what it will tell you is the file number of documents concerning them. And then you can then go find those files, sort of, because it's a mess.
Was it the case that the Russian embassy got closed in Paris because of the Bolsheviks, and they just went in there and took that stuff? Like, how did this...
Well, it was... So when the Bolsheviks took over, most of the embassies and consulates of the Tsarist regime, the monarchy, had been overthrown. And so between them and the Bolsheviks is this thing called the provisional government.
Yeah.
It was a kind of liberal / socialist government that functioned for about 8 months. And so it just took over. It actually disestablished the Okhrana. So because it was most of its founders were people that were hostile to it, the Okhrana was officially disestablished. And it even set up a commission of inquiry that was going to look into and try to ferret out all the evil deeds of the secret police. That never really got very far. So when the Bolsheviks took over, the question for consuls and ambassadors in foreign countries was whether or not they were we working for these guys? So many of them, including the guys that were running the embassy in Paris, argued we only recognize the Russian provisional government. We are not the diplomatic representatives of this group of crazies who have taken over. And so the Soviets had no control over the Paris consulate until the early 20s. And so the old guard sort of hangs on there for a while, and eventually the Soviets do come in and take it over. But in the meantime, Herbert Hoover, who was on this campaign to collect all the kind of war and other diplomatic materials he could, just basically stole it. I mean, I'm sure he paid somebody something, but as far as I can tell, he just got people to go in. No one was supposedly interested in this old secret police database and all of its archives, and they just carried this stuff off. But in some cases, I think it might not be unfair to say that things were taken without official permission.
Mm-hmm.
They had the main Okhrana archives in St. Petersburg, so that they had everything pretty much that was in Paris, since everything in Paris would have been theoretically copied to the main archive.
Okay.
Right.
And there are all kinds of questions about there were stories for years among Western Russian historians that the Okhrana records and even the early Soviet secret police files, a thing called the Cheka, which was just the Bolshevik version of the Okhrana, that those files had been systematically destroyed. It turns out they weren't. It's kind of amazing. These things were still there. They weren't open to any kind of public scrutiny, and they're still not, really. You generally don't get to look at anything that's intelligence related, no matter how old it is in most places. But yeah.
You said something interesting there when you talk about how the Cheka was just kind of like a successor to the Okhrana. And you hear this a lot now about the FSB, how it's a successor to the KGB. Do you find that in these intelligence agencies that like the name change, the regime may change, but those people generally stay the same? Is that safe to say?
They often do. Generally, a change in regime will mean that you're going to get a lot of the people who were working for the previous regime working for the new one. And that was true. I mean, if there were diplomats who didn't recognize the Bolsheviks, there were other diplomats abroad who did. They were generally in the minority, but within the country, I mean, think of it this way. Remember I just said that one of the things the provisional government did is that it disestablished the Okhrana, which meant that if you were a member of the Tsarist secret police, you were now what? Unemployed.
Mm-hmm.
So what do you have? You have skills.
Yeah.
You're a professional. You don't have to even be loyal to these. You have to work for them.
Right.
I mean, what else are you going to do? So your job, you're an expert in perlustration. You're an expert in opening mail. That was you would intercept mail and open it and read it and copy it and then put it back in and send it on its way. And they weren't supposed to know you'd done that.
Right.
Well, not everybody can do that type of thing. So, the Bolsheviks want to open people's mail just as much as the Tsar did. So you know how to do that. And it's early on. Years ago, there was a Russian historian by the name of, I think it was Viktor Bortnevsky. He never lived long enough to publish the stuff he did on this, which is too bad. But one of the things that he did was to look through the personnel rosters that he could find of people who were working in some of the main. So the early version of the KGB was called the Cheka, which was short for Special or Extraordinary Commission, okay? A name that tells you nothing. So he looked through this, and you would find it at the top, in the positions of command were politically reliable people. There were Bolshevik cadres. There are people. So the guy who's the head of the Cheka is a Polish Bolshevik by the name of Felix Dzerzhinsky. And Felix Dzerzhinsky is the real deal when it comes to a Marxist-Leninist zealot. He was a true believer. He also had been schooled by Jesuits, so that tells you something. I mean, he'd been trained in Jesuit schools, and all of that sort of was then brought into his approach to revolution. And Dzerzhinsky's attitude towards the revolution was very simple. Anything which served the interests of the revolution was good. Anything which obstructed the interests of the revolution was bad. That was his morality, and everything operated accordingly. And beyond that, was all scrupulously honest. Whatever else to say about him, supposedly he never stole a kopeck, and he frowned people in. So he wouldn't tolerate corruption within the organization. So this is the guy who's heading the new Soviet secret police, and most of his lieutenants were also Bolsheviks. That is, were political. But the thing that Bortnevsky discovered is that 80 to 90% of the staff people, the people actually doing things like opening letters or carrying out surveillance or even recruiting other agents, were former Okhrana employees.
Yeah.
Because Dzerzhinsky had to build a secret service overnight. He didn't have time to come in and train a communist secret service. So he put communists in the management positions of the Okhrana. That's basically what he did, and enlisted those people who needed jobs and needed the money and needed the security to wield their skills on behalf of the revolution, as opposed to wielding their skills to oppose the revolution.
I find that interesting because one of the things that I've found really interesting about the KGB, and I'm talking about later on towards the fall of the Soviet Union, is that there seems to be that the KGB really starts to embrace Russian orthodoxy and Russian nationalism. And that is what pretty much puts them in the position with their guy, Putin, to pretty much take over the country. And Putin very much comes from that kind of KGB milieu. So it may be just this, like, these former Okhrana guys were always there, and that sense of Russian nationalism and orthodoxy was just kind of covered up by this kind of communist veneer.
Well, I mean, that was always there. As much as the Soviet educational and political system discouraged religion and ostensibly discouraged nationalism as opposed to internationalism. Remember, in the USSR, we're all supposed to glory in being Soviet. And the fact that we're Russian or Azerbaijani or Ukrainian or Buryat Mongol isn't that's a secondary, that's a cultural matter. It's not a political or economic matter. But those are, I think those are just inherent parts of the human psyche and society which can't be really repressed.
Yeah, it's still like an imperial center. I mean,
yeah, it's the idea. Those ideas are going to linger on. And there were people, I've talked with people who goes, my family was, we were all everybody of importance were Communist Party members, but, my mom still kept an icon And it was one of those things that you would find both those currents within the same family. Another guy explained it by saying is that, again, it was his mother who told him, says, well, you don't have to believe in God. You don't have to believe there's an actual God. But all of these things are sort of cultural symbols. Okay, so I keep an icon, I keep religious images, not because I actually am devoted to that saint, but because I think that's part of the whole sort of it's kind of the mythology of who we are.
Yeah. Yeah. It's kind of like the opposite now. It seems like there's some nostalgia for the Soviet identity as part of their past that's been integrated by some.
That has always, there's always been that. It's like nostalgia in East Germany.
Yeah.
You grew up in East Germany, and now it's different. And it's in fact, I give you an example of that. You may already know about this. If you go to Berlin today, it's a unified city. But if you look around, there are still these, beyond the fact where the wall was, that East and West Berlin were, for the better part of a half a century, separate cities under separate administrations. So one of the things in East Berlin is that at the crossing lights, okay, when you're standing in the street corner across the street and the little pedestrian figure that comes on, well, the East Germans had a particular one, East Berlin in particular, the Ampelmann, and it's like this guy with a hat. It's like a character. So, but that's different than the ones in West Berlin. So after a unification, apparently the idea is, well, we're going to come in, we're going to standardize all of these things, and people threw a fit about it because that's what they were used to. I mean, it was just the fact that when I'm standing on the street corner and the light turns green, I expect to see this little figure, and you're going to something that is otherwise completely utilitarian and inconsequential.
Yeah.
I mean, what than what stick figure appears on the street crossing light? But that was important to them because it was a kind of symbol of the city and sort of and part of their identity. So those type of things I think are, practically speaking, impossible to eradicate from people. And I mean, think of it this way: why not look back in the Soviet times? Right, that's when Russia was even more. This is when the Soviet Union was
make Russia great again.
I mean, that's
it. You got it exactly. Make Russia great again. The Soviet Union was just a bigger, and everything was. We had an ideology, they had the whole sort of pride in the revolution. There were statues of Lenin everywhere. At least it was one of those things. And it was a period of, well, here's one of those things which Russians are, and I think justifiably, very proud of. I mean, from their standpoint, they won World War II in Europe. I mean, they argue that the Americans and the Brits and, God help them, the Canadians all sort of pitched in on this, but that our role was an auxiliary to their defeat of the Wehrmacht on the East. Their argument is that
through 45, great patriotic war.
They kind of have a point. I mean, really, 100,000 Soviet soldiers died just taking Berlin alone. I mean, and that's at the very end of the war. I mean, that's a horrendous amount of casualties.
Well, it's and the war is fought on their territory, so this isn't
right.
It's over. The war goes back and forth over Western Russia and leaves thousands of villages are destroyed, cities are wrecked, etc. So I'm not coming here to trying to give the Soviet, but it's important to keep in mind that is the view which is generally held, and they take it very, very seriously. And they don't have to agree with it to simply accept that that's absolutely the way that they see it.
One thing I was going to say was that I've heard it typified that Putin does not like Lenin, but he does admire Stalin. And some of the things that he said about Lenin, like he blames Lenin for basically the existence of Ukraine as a modern state. He blames Lenin for, essentially, even though that's not really true. But
no, not really.
But Stalin, he does admire Stalin, but not Lenin.
Well, Lenin's the idea guy. So first of all, Lenin's not really around in power that long. So the Bolsheviks take power at the end of 1917. Mm-hmm. And Lenin is in control. He is in control of the apparatus until he begins to suffer a series of strokes in 1922. So Lenin's whole period of power is effectively about 5 years. He'll hang on for another couple of years before he dies, but he's only running things for around 5 years. And that's a difficult 5 years. It's a civil war, which follows, famine, more war, the whole sort of early turmoil within the party. But what Lenin does is that in some way, through a force of will, is the guy who more than anyone else brings this regime into power. I mean, this is the argument that good, bad, or indifferent, no Lenin, no Bolshevik faction, no Bolshevik party, no real communist movement inside Russia. And very unlikely that any kind of actual revolutionary regime would have taken hold. And again, it's the key to understanding Lenin is his phrase: flexibility in means, inflexibility in goal. So the simplest goal was that what the Bolsheviks had to do, this is what I argue, is that we need to take power. We need to seize the machinery of the state, take control of all of its apparatus for coercion, because that's what they viewed the state. The state is simply an apparatus for the coercion of people. It has an army, it has a police, it has laws, it has courts, and it makes people do things. So what we need to do is to seize control of the machinery of the state, and we need to accomplish that by any means that's available. So this has nothing to do with being voted into office. That's the last thing, however means we can do it. We will essentially do through subversion and agitation. And on the other hand, if the Germans want to give it, if the Germans, who are nothing more than imperialists bent on controlling Russia, if those same Germans want to give us money to undermine the current Russian government with the possibility of us seizing control, we'll do it. And then we'll turn on the Germans, if need be. But that's, on the one hand, you can think of it that that's an extremely cynical and ruthless way to look at it. But the other thing about it is that it's effective. There is a crude genius in that. Know what it is that you want to achieve, have a good, definite goal in mind, and then be willing to embrace and exploit every possible means and opportunity to do that. It's like Dzerzhinsky, the only morality here is the achievement of your goal. Anything that helps you get your goal is good. Anything that obstructs it is bad. So Lenin sort of brings the regime in, and, in terms of creating Ukraine, there was already a Ukrainian nationalist movement. One of the interesting questions is, what are actually the physical dimensions of Ukraine? A name, by the way, which just means borderland. That's it. Yeah. See, it doesn't actually describe a people or a language specifically. It describes a vague geographical area north of the Black Sea, which has been interpreted in different ways. So what Lenin did was to incorporate Ukraine into the Soviet, and you created the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, which then became one of the other constituent republics of the Soviet Union. So that was created to partly mollify Ukrainian nationalism, give them a stake within this new Soviet system, and just to kind of arbitrarily draw boundaries around it. Just create something on a map that had that name to it. And Stalin, on the other hand, Stalin is, I probably will get into trouble for saying this, and I'm not a Stalin. There are, I think, some basically admirable things about Stalin, simply in his sheer, I'll give begrudging admiration to determination and success. I mean, even if someone is pursuing something that I don't believe in, or in some ways I might actively oppose, I appreciate guts.
Mm-hmm.
And Stalin as a politician and as a national leader, objectively, was very successful. Now, did his regime just run roughshod over human rights? Did it cause untold amounts of? It was horrific in that regard. But on the other hand, during that time, a huge amount of there's one way to put it. Without the industrialization, without the forced, often inefficiently applied and costly in terms of human misery industrialization that took place in the 1930s,
mm-hmm.
Hitler would have overrun Russia in 1941. Without a doubt, because that's what constructed the whole Soviet military industrial complex. And that's what it was ultimately that allowed the USSR to defeat Germany.
Yeah,
and that wouldn't have existed without Stalin's economic policies. Does that make him some kind of a prophet? No, but that in the end, that worked out. Now, I don't know. Could someone argue that, well, they've been better off being conquered by the Germans? Well, not really. You have to look into what the Nazis intended for that whole area. And
Lebensraum.
Yeah. They were going to clear the whole populations out. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, Hitler described it best. We'll reduce the Russian population by 50%, and those that remain will be taught how to read road signs and count to 100, so that they can be effective slaves for German colonists. So no, there was no future. That's the way that the whole Nazi ideology sort of looked at Eastern Europeans. Those were people who had no future.
Mm-hmm.
They were slated for extinction in the short term or in the long term. And remember, those people were serious about those things. They carried those.
Yeah. Right.
So Stalin is he's oddly in some way the kind of curse of modern Russia, whose ghost still haunts the place and will never be exorcised. And yet, you can conversely say he's in some way it's a preserver. I'm not going to use the term savior because it brings in things I don't want to get into, but the preserver in some way. It would be Russia in the modern sense could not exist without him. I think even to a greater extent, and would not exist. That's the most important. Would not exist without him.
The views expressed by the guests on Conspirinormal do not necessarily
No.
No, you can't really argue with those big picture observations. And yeah,
here's what this is more of a joke than anything else, but you mentioned Dzerzhinsky and the Jesuits, and I just, the Jesuits always seem to come up a lot in these things.
Weishaupt was trained by them too, right?
Yeah. So,
well, what did the Jesuits teach him? What did he learn from the Jesuits? That anything which advances the interests of the Church, of the Holy Roman Catholic Church, is good, and anything which opposes it is satanic evil. That's all he does is to take that kind of moral imperative and attach it to the party and communism as opposed to the Church. Right. That's it. He didn't become a Roman Catholic priest, as he considered at one point. He became a priest of a new religion,
the revolutionary faith.
I'll ask you about the latest episode that you did, which I think is particularly interesting. It's basically about Synarchy, but you start with this book that I had never heard of, and I'd heard of things like the Taxil hoax, which are kind of associated with it. But this thing called the Elected of the Dragon, and it's about this woman named Clotilde Bresson. And this is the kind of it's very much kind of the sensationalist conspiracy literature of the time. a lot of these things, like the protocols of Zion, are kind of going on at the, are being spread at the same time, and it reminds me of other things of like anti-Catholic polemics that I've read about that were actually from the 19th century in the United States. It kind of starts with this whole like Freemasonry and Illuminati. And this is a book that's written in it's discovered, quote unquote, in the late 1920s, supposedly.
Yeah, it's supposedly written around 1880, but it may have been.
Do you think that much like the protocols that it was kind of hoax literature, or that there could be some basis to it? Well, I guess we should explain the story behind it, because that's pretty.
Well, what's the basic? So the question comes down: how seriously do you want to take this? Because there are some parts of it that are, do you believe that marble statues can come to life? Okay, because that's part of the story.
Some of our listeners might. So.
I have a hard time buying that part of it, but that comes in. So what's the? If we can come up with a quick version of it. So the Chosen of the Dragon, which first appears in France, published in 1929. Brought into the literary world through people closely connected with the Jesuit order. Again, they pop up here. But so what's it about? Well, it supposedly tells the story of what begins as a beautiful 14-year-old Italian girl with the French name Clotilde Berson, whose father, who is a Illuminati Freemason, basically sells her to other Illuminati Freemasons, or brings her into this kind of orbit. Now, I have to combine that there are two things here. So there's a Masonic lodge. There are many of them, but her father is part of a particular, presumably some sort of continuation of the illuminated those Masonic lodges taken over by the Illuminati in the 18th century, which we have to assume in some weird way were still functioning, or they were some modern incarnation of that. So it's essentially the Illuminati is this, as what turns out is a satanic cult. Hey, there's a big surprise. Operating within the context of these supposedly Masonic lodges. So her father brings her to Constantinople, and she becomes a nymph of the night. She becomes the consort of the dragon. And the dragon, is Satan. No big surprise there. And this is where she's ushered into the Illuminati lodge. And there's a statue of the beast of the apocalypse with its its lion-like body and its 7 heads and 10 horns. And that's the statue. Then in the course of the story, she can, through her, magical vixen powers, animate, and which will become her boyfriend. Let's put it that way. But she will.
Dr. Spence, can you translate this into English for us? Can you translate the book into English? Because I really feel like this needs to be read. Like, this is amazing stuff.
Well, it's an interesting story. I don't think I'm the person to translate it, but there are plenty of people who could. So she goes on, she becomes a nymph of the night. She becomes the high priestess of the satanic Illuminati Freemasons.
All right.
And she's admitted to their highest council. And that's where, around 1875, she meets future American President James Garfield. He becomes her lover. He eventually decides that he wants to get her out of this whole sort of satanic web that she's in. And that makes the Illuminati mad. And first, they get him elected U.S. president, and then they have him assassinated. And then she eventually escapes the Illuminati and finds her way to a convent where, in one version of the story, she apparently lives happily ever after, and another version of the story, she's murdered by the gardener. So who's guess what? A member of the Illuminati Freemasons.
What was the reason that they allowed Garfield to become president if they were mad at him and then had him assassinated?
I guess that what they wanted to do, they wanted to get him away from her. So they wanted him to go back to the States. And the idea is that you'll head, the Illuminati has something like 9 different councils or circles. And the 9th circle is the highest. That's the ultimate that's the Politburo of the Illuminati. And so he was going to go to the U.S., become the head of the Illuminati there, and then through that means he would become president, which apparently he wanted to do. So he was kind of paid off. So that was to separate them, make him think that he was working for the Illuminati, actually organize the Illuminati in a greater basis in the U.S., and then they would kill him for his treachery because they're satanic Illuminati.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of things you have to buy into in terms of that story. And it is, you earlier mentioned something called the Taxil hoax, which is a story that becomes very popular in France about 10 years later. So keep in mind, Clotilde Berson's story isn't published. Supposedly happens around 1880, between 1875 and 1885. And then isn't discovered and published until the end of the 1920s. But in between this time, in the 1890s, there's a fellow named Leo Taxil, who's a somewhat disreputable journalist, sometimes a Freemason, sometimes a Catholic, either or both or neither, who comes up with this story which is vaguely similar. And in his story, there is a satanic cult called the Palladium, which is at the center of Freemasonry, and it's headed by an American, Albert Pike. Real guy, real Freemason.
I think we heard of him.
In Taxil's version, Albert Pike is the grand high poobah devil worshiper in the world and the head of the satanic Freemasons. And there's a kind of rough equivalent of Clotilde Berson. So Taxil says that there's also a satanic high priestess who's part of this, and her name is Diane. Well, she actually has two names. Initially, the character is named Sophie Sappho Walder. And then later that's changed, or another one is brought in, and it becomes Diana Vaughn. And that's the woman that eventually Taxil, his critics, man, let's show us this woman. Okay, we want to talk to her. Okay, there's some sort of satanic high priestess, have her on Oprah, or have a press conference. So he has a press conference in 1897 where he does not produce Diana Vaughn because he says she never existed. I made this whole thing up. And all of you who believe this story, especially you archbishops and heads of the church who went along with this, you're all idiots, and this just proves what gullible morons you all are. Yeah. This is the thing. This is why it's called the Taxil hoax. Tax will go for the better part of a decade. Mm-hmm. He and some accomplices spin all these tales about satanic Freemasonry, demonic high priestesses, all of this business. And then when he's actually told to put up or shut up, he simply admits that I made the whole thing up.
And you can find that stuff is in English, right? But those books are pretty rare.
Yeah.
There was like some republishing of some of that stuff recently, but it's in like this super fancy.
Yeah, the Taxil stuff, I think, the English titles of them would be the Secrets of Freemasonry, which I think was the first one, and then The Devil in the 19th Century.
Yeah, yep. Yeah, that Devil in the 19th Century, like some group did like some kind of GoFundMe or something. They made these beautiful versions of the books and stuff, but you can't even get the PDFs. It was like hundreds of dollars, but hopefully that'll be available for the public. I'm sure it would sell since this stuff seems to still be popular.
So the whole argument about Taxil, you always assume that would be the end of it. If the guy who told the original story comes forward and says it was a hoax, but it never is. And well, here's the argument as to why not. Some would argue that no, you see what Taxil, whose real shortened name was Gabriel Jogan Paget. All right. See, Leo Taxil is much easier. But Gabriel Jogan Paget, who was this kind of pulp writer, and to his dying day, I think he didn't live that much longer. He died in sometime before World War I. I think around 1907. But he never, he just said that, I made up this story. I did it for the money, okay, and the attention to that. And, it made a good yarn, and I ran it as long as I could. And also he said, just because I like to make fools out of people.
Yeah, he's described, Wikipedia describes him as, that article describes him as having anti-Catholic and anti-clerical views. So was he doing this in a sense to lure them in as suckers and pour some derision onto the Catholic Church?
Well, he started out early on writing what were kind of semi-pornographic anti-Catholic literature. So one was called the Erotic Bible. Mm-hmm. So he took stories from the Bible and he tried to show how they were really sort of slightly, hot.
Yeah,
and show that there was obscenity within the Bible if you read it in the right way. And they did the other one on the sex lives of one of the popes or of the Pap, of trying to, how many mistresses he had, this type of thing. So he was, and during this time, keep in mind, he was an active Freemason. Mm-hmm. And one of the things which was a common current in French Freemasonry was anti-clericalism, which means they hated the Catholic Church. That's what it came down to. So to be a French Grand Orient Freemason in the late 19th century would pretty much entail that you had a bad view of the Catholic Church. So he was writing stuff that was quite supportive of a general Masonic anti-clerical nature. He was lampooning and mocking the church. Then around 1885, he supposedly has a religious conversion. Well, he'd been raised a Catholic and then became a Freemason. And now he decides that, I'm going to repudiate all these evil Masonic ways and I'm going to return to the bosom of the church. And then, of course, he starts writing the Taxil hoax, which exposes Freemasonry as a satanic conspiracy, which a lot of people in the church thought, yeah, that's what we've always thought.
Right.
Go write more of that. Then some years in 1897, he reverses himself again and says, no, I was doing this in many ways to directly embarrass the church. So this is why there were some who subsequently argued that what Jogan Paget, Leo Taxil, what he had always been doing was running a psyop for the Freemasons. And that his job was to essentially go in, either a job he made for himself or a job he was assigned by someone else, was to create over-the-top, seemingly unbelievable, that is, an absurd scenario about Freemasonry that would attract the support of some within the church and outside of it. Just in other words, write a story that embraces every sort of weird thing that people believe, the worst things imaginable, and to get people believing it and then crash the whole thing. So what arguably would be the purpose of that other than embarrassing the church, which it did? Well, the idea would be to thereafter completely poison the well to anyone who would raise subsequent allegations. So if anything, if you take it to its one extreme, what it means is that what the story he was describing was substantially true. He may have embellished parts of it, but that it was, imagine this, that it was basically true and he was revealing this, but in a way that could be subsequently discredited. Mm-hmm. And that by discrediting something that was basically true, later, if anybody came up with any story or seemingly any evidence of something similar, you could go, that's bunk, because they all got it from this guy who came up with this story and it was a hoax. See, you can't believe it wasn't a hoax.
Was that an immediate reaction by some of the church and the people who had believed it?
Even at the time, yes, there were people who did not believe that. Part of it is, the other part, they don't want to admit that they were made fools of.
Right.
So one of the ways to avoid saying I was made a fool of is that this story is actually true, and this guy is simply, he is a lying Masonic propagandist who was largely telling the truth in order to discredit the truth by turning it into a lie.
So it wasn't just that this was totally discredited, and then you have the big war and all this, and then later on, this other book comes out and these other themes because it was kind of forgotten before. Other than his word for it and the word of there's another guy there actually is another person who contributes to the Taxil hoax, and it's an obscure German character. But the name of he uses the pseudonym of Dr. Bataille. So if you look at some of these, Bataille is what it looks like.
So you see Taxil's name and you see Bataille. Some people thought that it was just Taxil creating yet another version of himself, but it's actually a separate guy. And his last name is Hoax, Hacks, as far as anybody can tell. He's apparently a German. He might, by one story, he's actually a defrocked Jesuit priest. Yet again, they come up. So Taxil seems
I feel like we might be digging into the Jesuit master plan here.
So the story, but other than that, there's nothing but these guys claiming this. I mean, here are the basic facts as you can come down to it. The one salient fact is that they argue that Albert Pike was an American Freemason who was an important, and he was. Albert Pike he was probably the most important figure in American Freemasonry at the time. Mm-hmm. And the number of people listening will realize that his name shows up today in all sorts of conspiracy theories. He was a lawyer. He was a general for a time of the Confederate States of America, even though he was born in Massachusetts. I've never figured that one out. So he was a Yankee who then sort of rebelized himself, became a Confederate general, quarreled with Jefferson Davis, was also quite a proponent of Native American rights, and was actually quite active in getting Native Americans in the Indian Territory to fight for the Confederacy. Later, until fairly recently, had a statue in Judicial Square in Washington, D.C., erected by his fellow Freemasons who didn't care what side of the war he'd fought on.
He's the only Confederate general that is buried in D.C.
Yeah. So he has, and he's also somewhat famous or infamous for writing a Masonic book called Morals and Dogma, which is a very dense, detailed description of all of the degrees in the Masonic Scottish Rite. That's all it actually is. And so nevertheless, he's accused or generally claimed to have said all kinds of things in Morals and Dogma, some of which he actually does say and some of which he doesn't, and mostly in or out of context. But so they're naming a real person. So was he the head? Did he live in Charleston, South Carolina, where Taxil? Yes, he did. Okay. And he was the head of the Scottish Rite, which was a very important Masonic organization. And he was recognized as a prominent, probably the most prominent American Masonic scholar. Was he also simultaneously head of something called the Satanic Order of the Palladium? Well, there's nothing else. There is some reference to an actual Palladium order existing in France in the 18th century. So I think it's according to one of the Masonic encyclopedias, maybe it's Mackay's, where it mentions that for a brief period of time, sometime in the middle of the 18th century, there was a Palladium order, and it was suppressed by the French government because it was considered to be diabolical. In other words, Satanists. So, but that's the most you get, that 100 years earlier, that there had been some sort of small, vague, Luciferian Masonic group called the Palladium.
So with these books, the Taxil hoax books and Clotilde Bresson, well, especially the Taxil, the Taxil hoax is the basis for, I think, a lot of different conspiracy memes. I think you see a lot of things pop up. Even in the Taxil hoax, I believe somebody transforms into an alligator. I think that's actually in there. So
yes, magical transformations do take place.
Yeah, reptilian stuff going on.
The reptilian stuff kind of like even stems from that, and so there's a lot of these.
The obsession
there's a lot of different things that are in there.
Sordid sex and human trafficking
rights and these type of things. You could even make a clear connection even to like QAnon with some of the things that QAnon says.
Absolutely.
Right. And you make the point in the podcast that Jack Chick, helps to bring this into kind of apocalyptic evangelical Christianity. But there's this milieu that's going on in France that I think that these books are kind of contributing to, especially when this book comes out in the late 1920s. I mean, there's a lot going on in France, and that there's a contribution to the kind of the rise of fascism that's going on with some of these books. There's a sensationalistic quality.
Yeah, there's simplest way to put it is that France in the interwar period in the 20s and 30s is politically a mess. Or it's an example of flourishing democracy, because they sure go through a lot of governments. But it's a country which is more and more politically unstable, and you can see this in the rise and fall of governments. And in the French system, as in most Western systems, that depends upon parliamentary elections to the Chamber of Deputies. So you have elections in which parties then have the majority or can form a coalition, will then form a government, and then that coalition can very easily fall apart in the case of a new election, or if a party leaves it. And there's an increasing polarization between the right and the left. So not too unusual in the 20s and 30s. On the left, you've got this growing, very vocal, well-organized communist movement. That's one of the things to keep in mind about the communists, is that they're never necessarily terribly numerous. Right? There are quite a few of them. It's not an insignificant number, but their power actually comes through the organization that they wield over their members. And most political parties have, you've got some kind of central leadership, and then you have people who affiliate with the party by voting for it. But they generally aren't too actively involved. The party doesn't really, other than telling them who to vote for in elections, it doesn't have much influence over them. But the Communist Party, again, runs like something like the Jesuit. I mean, the idea is that once you're in the party, everyone is to play a role in this, and there's party discipline, and there is an official ideology. And it's simply capable of taking its members and mobilizing them and directing them in ways that other political parties can't. So that communists can be, even in limited numbers, far more influential than those numbers might suggest. Now, the communists imitate, their offshoots, their cousins are the fascists. And it's one of those things that I like to harp on, and it's not a particularly popular idea, but I think in some way if you look at it closely, it's the truth. Fascism, which is a term invented by one person, Benito Mussolini, in 1918, 1919. He comes up with the term. So if anybody wants to figure out what fascism is about, go back to Mussolini, because he's the guy who invented the whole damn thing. But Mussolini's whole political career into his adulthood and the whole early part of his life, he is a militant socialist. He is a Marxist. He's the rising star of the Italian Socialist Party when World War I rolls along. He's the editor of the party newspaper. And he was, in fact, he's the guy that Lenin who admired Mussolini in certain ways, despite their differences, would argue that Mussolini was the best guy the Italian socialists ever had. And when they lost him, they became meaningless. So Mussolini was a doctrinaire Marxist for much of his early career, for all of his early career. And then where he separated from the party was when the Italian Socialist Party didn't embrace Italy's entrance into World War I. So Italy only comes into the war after a year or so. And it's a big debate in Italy. There were people who didn't want anything to do with it, and there were people who thought this was Italy's destiny to fight in the war. I mean, if we don't fight in the war, no one will take us seriously. And Mussolini then, without ever abandoning socialism, embraces nationalism. He decides that he sees himself as fundamentally more an Italian than a proletarian. And he decides that the fundamental error in Marxism, in the Italian Socialist Party, is that it divides people by class. So what Marxism tells you is that the only true unity, the only real community that as a Marxist you can be part of is the working class. So the whole thing is about the liberation of the working class from the rule and oppression of the bourgeoisie and the nobility. And what that did was it divided Italians against each other. It meant that the Italian worker was the enemy of the Italian middle class, the Italian bourgeois, or the Italian, that an Italian factory owner and an Italian worker were warring ends. And that the whole goal of the Socialist Party and the Italian worker was to put the Italian factory owner out of business. And Mussolini thought that that destroyed the sense of an Italian community. So what he imagined, what he saw fascism as, and this is what fascism originally was, and the only thing it really is it was an attempt to combine nationalism with socialism. Notice how Hitler did that? Okay, the German fascists just turned it that's what they mean by national socialism, as opposed to international socialism. But on the other hand, it actually fundamentally entailed the same thing. So under fascism, the factory owners would continue to own their factories, but only under state direction. And the workers could still have some sort of labor unions, but only under state direction. And it would be the party, the fascist party, like the Communist Party in the USSR, that would rule everything in the name of the working class. So Mussolini created a kind of nationalist, class-blind socialism, which still had many of the same goals. So it's one of the things I've sometimes pointed people to very early on in the evolution of the Nazi Party, which are just copying. That's all Hitler started. He just copies Mussolini. And they come up with the 25-point program of the Nazi Party. You can go online and find this. Just look up 25-point program of the Nazi Party. It's from 1921. And it's their platform. What do we as National Socialists stand for? What do we want? And they want things like nationalization of industry, vast expansion in civil service, opening universities to everyone, destruction of the nobility, the creation of a people's army in the place of the old class-based army, confiscation of war profits, public ownership of natural resources. And that's where you find the socialist in National Socialist. And there's very little in that 25-point program. Now, they also go, we want to protect, the national culture, and they'll point out that Jews can't be German citizens because they're not Germans by blood. And the 25-point program, they can still live there, but they can only live there as aliens. And so it combines these kind of populist, nationalist, racialist elements with programs that would just come right out of the USSR. I mean, in terms of socioeconomic policy, there's not much to divide them. And that's why when you had people, there's this brief period in early World War II. Remember, before Hitler invades Poland and Stalin invades Poland, they both invade Poland. Hitler just invades it first. There's a deal made between Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia, the so-called Hitler-Stalin Pact, and they just divide up Europe between them and decide what countries and what parts of what countries will go from one side or another. And so between the outbreak of the war in 1939 and until June 1941, where Hitler ends the pact and invades the USSR, well, they're nominally allies, effectively. And there's a good deal of interaction, particularly in places like Poland early on, between communist commissars and Nazi officials. And there are places where Soviet commissars, doctrinaire communists, after consorting with their Nazi counterparts, will call these guys our brothers in class because they saw that similarity. Okay?
Interesting.
The Nazis are sort of like, think of these as two religious sects. Okay, they're sort of like the Orthodox Church and the Roman Catholic Church. Both of them think that they're off on some things, but we can't deny that they're Christians. We can't actually deny the legitimacy of their fundamental beliefs. We just differ upon how they implement those particular beliefs and how they go about them. But that was something that was, even to someone who was, had been raised in the Soviet system, they could look at the Nazis and their policies and their approach to the world, and they could see something which was recognizable. They could see common values which were at work. So what this boils down to, and arguably some of the controversial conclusion of this, is that what we're usually taught to believe is that fascism and Nazism and communism are two opposite poles. They are right and left. And that, I will argue, is fundamentally incorrect. They are siblings. Fascism and all of its forms are a mutant offshoot of Marxian socialism.
The communists would say every fascism is a failed revolution.
Yeah. There's, closer to, they're a failed object of the faith, but they still essentially believe, the central thing they believe in, again, is this power of the state to transform.
The totalitarian ends.
Totalitarian states.
However, it does seem in fascism that, and you did mention that there is a state control over a privatized capitalist economy, that there's not a problem with a privatized capitalist economy, which is essentially what you have in China today, which is an authoritarian party that runs a capitalist-oriented society. So it seems that with fascism, you can still have the rich. It's just that everybody works, the rich work for the good of the nationalist community. Yes, that's the whole, so one of the things that there was a left within the Nazi party that the Strasser brothers. So the Strasser brothers were part of, they were like the red Nazis in this case. And their whole critique of Hitler was that he was a sellout to the bosses. That the generals and the bosses bought him off, and he was the guy they wanted in the head of the party because he would go soft on them. Whereas they wanted to take control, and again, they wanted to abolish the old army. They wanted to get rid of all those aristo army officers and create a kind of German red army, or brown army, I guess in this case. And then they were going to expropriate capitalism. Hitler, and the Strasser brothers' criticism of Hitler, I think, was fundamentally correct. He did sell out. Okay, the generals got him in. The generals and industrialists put him into power. He was a better politician. He realized that he needed their support to get into power. But once in power, he began to restrict. He never really got along with the army, and his long-term plan remained to eradicate the old officer corps. Notice the fact that they were the ones who were consistently trying to kill him. Yeah, I think he wanted to replace. I mean, eventually, I think the idea was that the SS would replace the army.
Yes, in the long. Well, it's similar to his concordat with the Catholic Church. Mussolini was an atheist. He detested the Catholic Church, but he made a treaty with them. Why? Because he knew that most Italians were Catholics, and if he got on the goods, if he seemed to be getting along with the church, that would strengthen his hold over the public.
Yeah, which I would say is another difference between the two, is that fascism is more likely to embrace religion. Now, the Nazis, I think, wanted to create their own religion, essentially.
But it will embrace religion without any real religious fervor behind it. That is,
it's a more cynical approach.
He cared. All he wanted to do was to exploit the church for its PR value. Hitler made a deal with the Vatican, but Hitler's real view of the church, he goes, in the future, we will squash it like a toad.
I mean, Napoleon essentially does the same thing with the church, too. I mean, when he comes to power, he realizes the utility of the church and the fact that it would bring domestic tranquility. He didn't really care as long as, things were okay in his regime.
Well, even the Bolsheviks do the same thing. They on the one hand carry out an official atheist policy, that is, the state will promote atheism. But on the other hand, they never destroy the Orthodox Church. They expropriate its property, but they allow a Russian Orthodox Church to continue to exist. Excuse me, because again, it curries favor with a certain segment of the population. In the future, it will fade away. But in fact, I'd argue that the attitude of the Bolshevik regime and of Mussolini's fascist regime and of Hitler's Nazi regime in the long run was precisely the same. They all intended to plow religion, the church, under. It was just what they could use it for in the meantime.
Is one ingredient that separates fascism from the communist totalitarians this occult element, for lack of a better word, whereas they don't want to destroy religion to just create some strictly, materialist utopia, but there's like some other kind of metaphysical thing going on.
Well, Mussolini,
with at least some of the founders.
The fundamental work about fascism, I suppose, is Mussolini's The Doctrine of Fascism, which, it's been tried. You can go and read it. It's not very long. I kind of defy you to make much sense out of what it was that you just read, because it's really this kind of, it just goes. But one of the things that Mussolini keeps bringing up, and this is interesting for someone who personally is an avowed atheist, is he talks about fascism being a spiritual movement. More than anything else, we're a kind of spiritual movement. And so part of the question is, what is he actually, how is he using that term? Mm-hmm. Because he's not really using it to mean Catholicism. He's not really using it, I think, to mean Christianity. He seems to be using spiritual in the idea that fascism is a kind of religion in and of itself. It's a religion of the nation. So the whole idea, everything, instead of society being organized around a social class, instead of it being organized around the proletariat, instead, it's going to be organized around this idea of Italianness or Germanness.
And some of that probably comes from like the old civic religion of Rome.
Yeah, to some, and so there were people, among those kind of quasi-occultists who crop up in fascism, there were those who wanted to do just that. They wanted to revive the Religio Romana. They wanted to bring back the old gods, which was never really embraced. And then you've got people like Mussolini finds around him, and the people who are trying to influence him are occultists like Julius Evola. And Evola is sometimes called the Rasputin of fascist Italy. And Evola will later go on to collaborate with the SS. And I don't think that's because, and probably get argument about it, but I don't fundamentally think that's because Evola is ever politically a fascist or a Nazi. He simply sees those things as a means to an end.
Also people felt like they had to make a decision between communism and fascism in a lot of these places at times in history. So,
and it's fascism made a deal with the Vatican, and that deal worked out pretty well. He allowed the Pope to retain the small, nominally independent state. So remember, it was that treaty that created the Vatican City. Previously, the Pope used to rule all of central Italy, and then when Italy unified, it was taken away from him, and he refused to recognize the legitimacy of the Italian state. And the Italian state just ignored him, which I guess shows that, being Pope isn't what it used to be. So what Mussolini did is that he now made it possible through this agreement for you as an Italian to be both a loyal Italian, loyal to your king and state, and have no conflict with your position as a Catholic, because now the Pope said that it was okay for Italy to be there, and the Pope was given his own tiny country and nominal independence. But neither side liked each other. I mean, the Pope and the people in the Vatican never really believed that Mussolini was on their side. They thought that he was preferable to the commies, because they were pretty sure that the commies would simply come in and bulldoze them right away. he was willing to make a deal, and Mussolini didn't care about the Catholic Church. He wasn't interested. He didn't believe in it at all, but nevertheless, it was useful for him politically because it buttressed his political position among the Italian populace. And Evola somehow wanted to, he could see that Mussolini controlled the state, and whoever controls the state and who controls education and all of the power that goes with it, here's a person who could institute some of our esoteric ideas. That, think about it this way. Think of, instead of just being a group of rogue cultists somewhere meeting in Rome, we can now get the state to approve and institute our rituals. That we can get our ideas to actually influence the government, even with, in some cases, of them not realizing what they're doing. I guess the simplest way to think of it is that everybody's just using everybody.
Mm-hmm. And then similarly in Germany, you kind of had the marriage of these old occult orders with the German Workers' Party that then turns into...
Well, the German Workers' Party grows out of an occult order.
Yeah, yeah.
So the origin of this whole thing is the Thule Gesellschaft, the Thule Society, which is started by an occultist, which is the branch of another German, the Germanen order, the German order. And what they did was they created a workers' political party or political circle as a means to distract the German workers in Munich away from the communists. But then so that they could exploit them for their purposes. So the interesting thing to keep in mind is that the whole origin of the National Socialist or Nazi Party comes out of the German Workers' Party, which come out of the German Workers' Circle, which was a wholly owned and created subsidiary of the occult Thule Society for its own obscure purposes.
And I guess where we want to go with it is that this is an alternative that seeks to synthesize this occult esoteric stuff with like a spiritual mission with what's seen as an inevitability of some kind of totalitarian socialist future. And it seeks to harmonize things, right? And that's where the influence of Synarchy comes in.
Well, Synarchy is another idea which is born out of occult tradition. So in that episode, I sort of explained the backstory of it, which very quickly is that in the 1880s, there was a French esotericist, that is a man very interested in the occult, Rosicrucian, a Freemason, a member of the Martinist order, by the name of Alexander Saint-Yves d'Alvedre. And he was approached by what he called emissaries of the Eastern Wise Men. Yeah, they always come from that. They're always Eastern Wise. They're always some guys.
The Ascended Masters?
We have mystical doctrines for you. If this sounds vaguely like a ripoff of Madame Blavatsky and Theosophy and her Mahatmas, it is. I don't know.
Which also is an aside, Dr. Spence. I mean, Theosophy, can lean pretty heavily fascist too.
It can lean that way, it can lead to the left. I mean, Annie Besant, who was one of the more prominent leaders in the 1920s, was both the head of the Indian National Congress, even though she was an English woman. So she promoted Indian nationalism. I don't think she was ever a member of the British Communist Party, but she was in spiritual union with it. What one would call a fellow. She thought the communism was great. Never said a bad thing about communism, and then was also a theosophist. So had no real. The thing might be is that from the standpoint of, let's say, an esoteric philosophy, one of the things you believe is you're above mundane politics. So politics is just again something to be used,
render unto Caesar
purposes. Yes, as much as you can, and it's a. I mean, another example of that was a Russian occultist and Buddhist by the name of Nikolai Roerich, and Nikolai Roerich actually works as an intelligence source for the Soviet secret police. Not because he's ever a communist, but because he believes that communism and the Communist Party can foster the development of Buddhism, or of his mystical brand of Buddhism. And one of the reasons they can do this is he thinks that both of them oppose Western colonialism in Asia. So what Roerich wanted to create was a vast pan-Asiatic, pan-Euro-Asiatic Buddhist empire. And now when he looks at Russia, Soviet Russia, notice you've got, what is it? It's a Eurasian state. It stretches all the way from Europe to the Far East. Hell, half of Asia is already in it.
Right.
So why not work with what you've got? So you've got this totalitarian regime, which officially doesn't have any religion, but will use any of them. So he'll go around and he'll say that, that Lenin is the new white Buddha. Okay. He's the Maitreya.
Yeah.
He is the Buddhist Messiah who's going to appear. Not because Roerich actually believes that, but he thinks he can use it to advance his ends. He wants to use communism to advance Buddhism. The Soviets want to use Buddhism to advance communism. Win-win situation.
Right.
So Sandeep Dalvedra gets his message from the Eastern mystic masters, who give him this plan that he calls Synarchy. And Synarchy basically means to rule together, joint rule. But the way it would work is this. What you would do is you would get rid of political parties. It would be nothing of this kind. There's no politics. And you would use what would be essentially a totalitarian regime to organize societies into different spheres or interest groups. So there would be a sphere of the industrials, the business owners, okay, the bankers and the factory owners, the workers, the artists, the engineers and technocrats. And each of these would have a sphere within society and be self-governing, but they would join together to basically run society. So you get the engineer, the artist, the worker, and the entrepreneur, but they all have to be under some higher authority. And that higher authority would be the mystics, a non-political order of occult adepts who would guide society in the best spiritual direction and control the interaction between the other groups and reconcile them. Now, basically, that's an early version of what emerges in fascism is corporatism. And Mussolini, oddly enough, will do the same sort of thing. The French, the Italian industry would have their representation, the workers would have theirs, the artists would have theirs, but all under the authority of the fascist party, which would dictate everything. And so this becomes the idea, but Synarchy, the essence of it is that it would be a society guided by the absolute rule of an enlightened mystical elite.
Priest king.
And this could be placed into power through any of these systems. So in the 20s and the 30s, the Synarchist movement in France isn't a political movement. It is a kind of spiritual movement, for lack of a better term, sort of what I think that Mussolini was talking about, that operates in all political currents. And so it tries to recruit people both in the technocratic sphere, it recruits people on the left, it recruits people on the right. It fosters fascist groups, socialist groups, technocratic groups, any groups that it can utilize, because it's in all of them. And the idea is that it will control all of them.
Are his influences ultimately from the thought that is a reaction against the French Revolution and modernism itself, that kind of looks back to the ancient regime in France and to the old medieval world as this more harmonious, modeled on the heavens, perhaps, civilization and society?
In some ways,
to get back to some kind of metaphysical model of that, it's the elite, the top are these priest kings who are modeling society based on some kind of like cosmic plan or order.
Well, if you go back to the world before 1789, the world before the French Revolution in France, so the idea, the sort of vision of how these things worked was that, and this was true for most European society and most other societies. You had the official hierarchy, and basically that meant the monarchy and the church, the king and the church within France. And they worked together. The church legitimized the king legitimized the church. He gave it a spiritual monopoly over the people, and they told everybody that the God had made this man their king. And it was their religious, to oppose the king was to oppose God. To oppose God was to oppose the king. And everybody else that you sort of look, I mean, you look at the way in which sort of the French politics was divided. There was the thing that started the whole revolution was this thing called the Estates General, which was a kind of, and most pre-modern European societies had these, and they were, well, the Parliament in England started out this way. You had the House of Lords, where the nobles sat, and then you had the House of Commons, where everybody else sits. Okay, mostly the non-nobles with money. And in the Estates General, you had three groups represented: the nobility and the church and everybody else, the third estate. And each of them had one vote, which meant that within the Estates General, the king presiding over all, that the nobles and the church always could outvote everyone else 2-1, because they voted as estates, as specific interest groups. And that's what the third estate didn't like, and that's why there was the revolution in 1789. So, but some people argued, as unfair and disproportionate as that might be, that kind of a society gave everybody knew what their place was. And that the way that this was supposed to work is that the church was supposed to administer to the spiritual needs of people, but it also ran hospitals and orphanages. If you couldn't get a job doing anything else, you could become a monk or a nun. Okay, there was always an opening for you there. That the church administered to people, that it was the social welfare network. Let's put it that way. That's what the church was supposed to do. It fed the poor. It took care of the sick. The king led the armies and had the magistrates and controlled those, staffed by the nobility, who were the generals and the judges, and the craftsmen worked their crafts and organized their guilds, and the peasants grew the food for everybody. And the nobles also owned the land that the peasants worked on, but ideally they were supposed to look out for the peasants. Mm-hmm. That they had an obligation, the noblesse oblige, the obligation of the nobility, which meant that the people who worked for you in your land were not your slaves. They were, in a sense, your sort of children. You had a responsibility as a nobleman to take care of those people. Now, if all of this worked the way that in the ideal way it was, nothing democratic, but it was a functional society. Everybody had a place in that society, and people had different responsibilities. In reality, of course, there was a huge amount of selfishness and corruption, and the nobles didn't always do what they were supposed to do, and the peasants felt abused by everyone, and like burning chateaus. So that was part and parcel of it as well. But it was something that people could look back on as this kind of organic society. And it's, I have to say that, again, if with the best of intentions, in an ideal sense, that was a society that worked. And by the way, it was a society that had worked imperfectly for centuries. I mean, think, until modern times, when hadn't people lived that way? There'd always been a king or an emperor or a poobah of some kind, and there was some kind of priestly class. And everywhere you went, 90% of the people grew the food for everyone else and generally didn't own the land that they worked. The people who did the most work had the least power. The people who did no work had the greatest power, with some gradations in between.
I feel like we're getting back to that. I feel like we're going back to that in some ways, but
well, I don't know. If you look to a future in which AI puts us all out of work, then what are you going to get? This is the idea. well, okay, everybody will have tremendous the future, seem that way. So, well, AI will eliminate any kind of human labor. See, that will be in some ways the ultimate expression of communism, right? No one will have to. There will be no labor, and therefore, when there's no labor,
automated luxury communism.
Right, there will, and you'll just get money to go out and indulge your interests and get PhDs in everything. Well, look, that's not going to work. That's not going to work. I mean, it's sorry to say, but if you give people just a lot of money and free time, they'll just spend it on blow and hookers and video games and other things.
What if we have the right enlightened elite to guide that AI?
Just like in Synarchy. What if the mystics are placed in control? What if we take the great Carsoni and put him in control of it? Well, yes, that's the...
And instead of it being, marching orders from God, it will be from a literal non-human intelligence that far surpasses us, and it would be a beyond dispute.
It will be what was best for you in that case. Well, what it ultimately means is that it just renders all of you obsolete.
Yeah.
Your lives are meaningless. Your existence is meaningless. And therefore, you no longer serve any useful purpose. Okay? Billions of people who function for no other reason than just mindlessly entertain themselves. Okay, so they'll be permanently unemployed and have more time to sit around watching YouTube. Which I shouldn't criticize because, we're on YouTube, but, my God, how much can you do that?
Like you said, I guess everyone's just going to have a podcast. And
well, yeah, it's just, and that's...
Oh, you could use AI for that too. So
that's...
You can come... I mean, AI can just replace anything. You just don't need it. And eventually, our robot masters will realize that. That will be unnecessary.
I don't want to dip too much into politics.
I think everything we've been talking about is political, though, Adam.
Well, yeah, we do on the show, but it does seem that guys like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, and just to name those two, but I know that there are more, and I think Musk sees himself in this way, that they do see themselves as a form of philosopher king, that there is a certain synarchist
they are
among them, and I really think that Musk believes that he is absolutely saving the world,
or he's having a hell of a good time at it.
The way I see him, Dr. Spence, is, and I've shared this with Sir Fiel, if you're familiar with Alan Moore's Watchmen, there is the character Ozymandias in it, who I'll just, spoiler alert. So if you haven't seen Watchmen, just don't listen to my next couple of sentences. But he essentially, in the plot of the graphic novel, the film, the world is on the brink of a nuclear war. And Ozymandias pulls off this fake alien invasion in the graphic novel. They change it in the movie. But he pulls off this fake alien invasion in order to have humanity unite. So he essentially makes this decision to kill millions of people to save billions. This is what he does. And I think Musk feels that he's in a similar situation to this fictional character, and that Musk was getting very worried about about nuclear war. And so that he essentially got Trump elected and put in there because he somehow thought that he knew that Trump would make some kind of approachment with the Russians. But I think that, Ozymandias in that graphic novel is very much the model of the philosopher king. And I think that Musk sees himself in much that same light of I am literally saving the world. And after I save the world, I'm going to have humanity jump to the next planet, essentially, and become an interplanetary species. This is where he sees himself. This is how he sees his role in the world. And I don't think that people are really grasping that.
He sees himself, at the very least, as a very important person. And I'm not arguing that he isn't. I mean, look, this is the guy who now has the ear, is in some way far more than Rasputin. He's sort of Trump's Rasputin.
He is.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's kind of stretching that a bit, but that's one way to think of it. This is a guy who
looks like a Bond villain, like he's
it's a Bond villain made good. I mean, he is kind of like a Bond villain, but he now has the ear of the President of the United States and ability to influence him. He's been given by that president considerable, power, completely unelected power, to go and restructure the federal government, and also he's trying to do all of these things. So I would be, rightly or wrongly, Elon Musk probably considers himself to be the single most important person in America at this point, and certainly in the American government, and he's probably correct. Again, whether that's good, bad, or indifferent, that's the situation.
Yeah.
As it is.
This new kind of gilded class who are, have gotten these fortunes from technology. I think they are sensing this kind of sense of like responsibility and needing some kind of cosmic mission, because their power in a lot of ways is larger than the state. So it's like, I think a lot of them are turning to philosophy and thinking that it's on them to now.
A lot of these guys seem to be, they think that they're discovering the secret, the mysteries of life, and they're just sort of retreading occult ideas that have been around forever. But it's like, this is new to me, therefore in some way I have invented it. And
and because occultism was such a gentleman's hobby for the most part, in the last Gilded Age, it's pretty similar, because no one else had time to really get into all these esoteric systems besides people who had means.
But it becomes one way to think of it is that very, very few human beings ever achieve great wealth. I mean, most of us have some trouble paying our bills.
Right.
But there are some. There are the blessed among us, the Musks and the Rockefellers of the world, who achieve wealth beyond anything that kings or emperors could have. I mean, they could buy and sell governments. What do you think of that? Mm-hmm. And there are so few of them that the question that has to occur to someone in that position is, why me? Why do I have this wealth? Because I look out across the sea of humanity, and barely anyone does this. So there's only one or two reasons for it. Either I just won some sort of random lottery. Okay, I was just lucky, or I have been chosen for this. I was given this wealth to accomplish some great thing. Now, what are all the great things I can possibly think of that I've ever wanted to do? And that, I think, and that's what Musk seems to be doing. I'm going to go to Mars, and then I'm going to reform the federal government, and then I'm going to bring universal peace, and I've got all of this money, and I've got the president of the United States listening to everything that I say.
Yeah. Yeah, I think
how that string runs out.
Yeah.
I am curious, Dr. Spence, and I wanted to get your thoughts on this, especially. I mean, we are living through, I think, some really momentous times, and I think in the last month or so, we have really seen a total realignment of American foreign policy. Trump is, he's made inroads with Russia. It almost feels like we've essentially switched sides. And events are moving so fast, but that by the time that we get this podcast out next week or whenever, things might have completely changed again. So we're recording this on March 5th. There was the whole meeting and blow up with Zelensky on February 28th. They've cut off, military aid to Ukraine. Essentially, the Ukrainians are essentially being ground down and beaten back in the war by the Russians. I mean, the war is a horrendous, and there is this rift now between the United States and its traditional partners in Europe. And that basically a lot of people are looking at this and saying, we're looking at the end of the post World War II system. Like that essentially is coming to an end, and now the United States is going to be basically just another pole in the multipolar world. I mean, so there's a lot going on. Do you have any thoughts as an historian about this?
Well, okay, the main thought as an historian is that never try to predict the future, because you'll be wrong. I mean, you might occasionally be right about this or that, but the further out you go. So, I don't want to... And oddly enough, that's one of the things that historians are always asked to do, is that, well, this happened, so what's going to happen next? I don't know what's going to happen next. As you said, the things could change completely within the next week. We're living in a period, for one reason, of a great deal of flux, and there are a lot of things going on. Okay, and one of the things, there may be people who don't want to hear this, but my fellow Americans, one of the things we just have to confront is that the United States does not have the influence in the world that it did previously. Nobody is terribly interested in what it is that we have to say, and they're not interested in our leadership. They're interested in our money and our cooperation and our furthering their goals. But, the Europeans don't want us telling them what to do any more than we want them doing so. And it is, whether we like it or not, it's always been a multipolar world. I mean, the closest you ever got to, in the post-World War II period, what had happened? The French and British empires collapsed. I mean, the collapse of the British Empire is really quite important. And in the space of 10 years, really, beginning with the independence of India, I'll take it up that in the space of 15 years to the early 1960s, the empire just goes apart. And the French Empire is gone. Germany virtually disappears as any kind of organized state. And Italy, well, who cares? Right? So you've got two fundamental powers. The bigger of the gorillas is the United States, because they come out, the British not only lose their empire, they also owe us money. They're dependent upon us for security. And the basic choice that Western Europe faced in the late 1940s was whether it was going to be American hegemony or Soviet hegemony. That was it. Because if the U.S. wasn't there, there was no way that the British, that a non-functional German state, and the French and the Italians, the communists would have taken power in Italy. They would have taken power in France. That would have been the end of it. Britain alone might have withstood that. There would have been a red wave that would have washed across Europe, and that would all have become behind the red curtain, or rather behind the Iron Curtain. And so, for all of those elements in Western Europe, all of the traditional elements, all of the unreformed, everybody who didn't want to be under Soviet rule, under Russian rule, which they equated with being under Asiatic rule, because when they look at Moscow, they always see the shadow of Genghis Khan. That's part of the Western mindset about Russia. It is the East. I mean, notice the inability of Europeans to ever talk about Russia as part of Europe. It's always Russia and Europe. Even though Russia is in Europe, okay, they look pretty much like, but they're seen as an other. They're orcs. That's it.
Which Russia is just as paranoid about being
and the Russians
from the West.
The West has always been degenerate and debased and full of orcs who hate us and want our stuff and are constantly attacking us. So there's a centuries long mindset of antipathy between the two, and it's part of this. It goes back. There are these elements in it. Even before there's a Russia, there's Attila the Hun. Okay, there are the Mongols. There's Tamerlane. And one of the things that within the kind of European mindset and experience is that the threat does come from the East. The enemy is always in the East. From the standpoint of Christendom, what direction does Islam come from? The East.
The
I mean,
foreign
never mind.
religion and then the foreign ideology comes from there.
Yes.
Later. Yeah.
So it's always the East is where the ravening hordes are. That's Gog and Magog. And it just sort of changes faces, and whatever sort of the ruler of the East becomes the new Attila the Hun of the moment in that case. And from the Russian standpoint, the way again, it's just different. Is it Charles the 12th? Is it the Swedes invading us, or is it the Magyars, or is it the Germans, and the Germans again, and the French and the British, all at one point? They attack. It's one. It's not any particular face or nationality. It is simply the godless, non-orthodox, debased Westerners lusting for our riches.
Yeah. Yeah, the Russians have they have a hang up about the Fourth Crusade, and didn't even happen to them. Like, it's kind of strange.
But they see themselves as the heirs of Byzantium.
Yeah.
Yes.
Even though it was the fall of Byzantium that got their whole thing going.
Right.
Otherwise, they'd just be part of Byzantium. Never expect any kind of logical consistency in this. All of these kind of paradigms break down. Okay. Yeah. Russia's constantly invaded by pernicious Westerners. Well, the first of those pernicious Westerners was a Viking
Russians
named
themselves,
who certainly wasn't a Russian, who set up the whole dynasty that they follow from. So, it was thanks to a Western invasion that Russia got started to begin with. But, it's just, history is just things happening and people making up self-serving stories about it. So
there you go.
The rest of the world fought itself. Europe basically blasted itself into ruins, and out of that in 1945, the USSR and the US emerged as the only coherent winner. That's it. Now, that situation is never going to last. And this is the thing. We always think this situation is going to be permanent. Well, this is just the way it's going to be from now on. It's the end of history. No, it's not. And so over time, China's going to get stronger. Why? Because China's it's the natural hegemonic power in the East. There's nothing particularly weird about that. Compare the two. Is it going to be Japan, or is it going to be China? China was weak. The Japanese tried to do it, but the Japanese just weren't strong enough. Chinese, once they get their excrement together, would be. And there's no particular reason for the U.S. to be the hegemonic power in Asia, because we're not in Asia. Mm-hmm. In the Americas, yes. And believe me, the Chileans and the Mexicans and the Brazilians know that, which is why they both love and hate us at the same time. And then in Europe, that's going to be somebody, and that's what it was. That's what the Germans fought themselves to virtual national destruction for in 2 world wars, just to see if they were going to be the big boss of everything. Then the odd thing is that they turn around and basically get that in the European Union. Okay, they're the dominant factor in it. It's the odd thing. The EU has given Germany the clout within Europe that 2 wars failed to do.
Right.
That's not lost on some conspiracy theorists, of course.
But part of it is that it's going to be somebody. So if you look at the European, and the real question there was, the British always had their interests offshore. The British Empire was an offshore thing. They didn't have territory in Europe. They just didn't want anybody too strong in Europe that could threaten their empire offshore. So the battleground in Europe as to who was going to be the hegemonic power, it was basically between France and Germany. So back in 1800, everybody was afraid of Napoleon. Because Napoleon commands France and it's got more people, and he almost does it. And then it's going to be the Germans, and it's either in the form of Kaiser or Hitler. But it's not going to be Bulgaria. Bulgaria is never going to dominate the continent. It's not going to be Portugal, or no matter what they think, Sweden, nor probably Italy. So you've got one of two contenders. It's the Germans, it's the French, or it's the orcs, the Russians. Okay, because they're the more of them. And it's still a kind of contest. But a multipolar world was going to emerge, and it has. It's not going to happen. It's already happened. And, the other thing is I think it's reasonable to say that the United States has its own sort of internal issues to deal with.
I'm curious if you think that there is a possibility that for the expansion of liberal democracy, that Ukraine was the bridge too far.
Well, I mean, part of that would come down to what you really mean by liberal democracy. Yeah. Because it's, this takes us off into a whole type of thing. But one of the things that electoral democracies ensure is that only some of the people get the government they want. So it's, if the person sitting in Congress isn't the person you voted for, you're not being represented by the person that you wanted. So where's your democracy in that? If I could claim that there's not a single person sitting in Congress that I voted to put in there, how is this my democracy? This is a democracy by other people, by other morons who voted to put these fools into office, and I don't recognize them.
If somehow you're the guy,
okay.
If somehow you're the guy that's out there that's voted losing candidate every time, I guess you are not represented in that democracy.
Yes, you're not represented in the democracy. So about half the population is never really represented in that, no. and that's just counting the ones that actually vote. So, in terms of local elections, we get local elections around here for mayor and city council and the rest in it. And I think maybe 20% of the electorate actually votes in it. So it's largely a popularity contest between how many friends do you have and how many favors you can call in. So I don't know. I'm just saying here, why is that a democracy when 80% of the people didn't vote for it? They might have argued that they could have voted for it, and they were just too lazy to do it, and there's certainly something for that. But they're also just completely disinterested. They don't care. So
I guess what Adam means is a Western. Was that a bridge too far in helping to create a Western-oriented state?
Well, trying to clone a Western European country in Eastern Europe.
Right.
That's never been particularly successful because Eastern Europe is different. There's not much of there's no real history of that there. I mean, part of it to keep in mind is that politics are local custom. Okay, the whole thing about American democracy isn't that it makes any sense or that it's particularly representative, but it's just the way we do things. It's the political game we play. We understand it, and one of the essential parts in understanding it, one of the things that makes that work, is to assume that when your party or your candidate loses, it's not the end of the world. That, okay, there will be another election, and you can try next time. You can get a chance to do it again, as opposed to the losers ending up dead or in jail.
Right. Which means that there's some kind of basic standards.
And it's just, there's an oligarchy. Okay, there's a political class. You can recognize them. They've become more obvious. They're entire dynasties of these people. They're not hard to recognize. There are whole families, usually rich, that spend their lives in political office when they're usually rich enough, not to have to do that. So maybe that's a kind of noblesse oblige, or maybe it's just an example of their hopeless narcissism. But nevertheless, we tend to be governed largely by wealthy people, which I guess they would think that's okay. But that's the way our system works, and it does pretty well. All right? It functions. You got a fire department, you got the police, you got paved roads, you got public schools. What the hell else do you want, really? I mean, what do you think you're supposed to get out of this? You have a functioning civil administration, and you have some kind of political process that a lot of people can participate in. And true, most of it's performative. I mean, this again is, I would basically argue that most democratic procedures, even elections, are performative. We sort of act these things out. They're like civic plays at one point or another. But you really don't have much impact in the people you're voting for, do you? I mean, there's a council, or I mean, it's not even that the best example of a performative politics is a political convention, because the deal's already been made in almost all cases. Yeah. You're just performing it in public, and everyone is ritualistically voting for it. So, but those are all, and the French have their peculiar traditions, and the British, look at the monarchy. What is that but a peculiar tradition? Why do you need those people? I mean, one of the things that I've argued, and sometimes actually pissed off some of my British friends, is by arguing is that the British royal family are simply the richest welfare family on earth. Because that's all they do. They just live off the public dole.
It's true.
They just get a lot more money off. And they fill what? They fill a completely ritualistic, performative purpose. Their job is just to be the king or the queen and to go around and show themselves and represent and embody the majesty of the state like some kind of living god, which is essentially what they are. But it's all make-believe. It's just a particular culture. This is why the Brits, I think, are so attached to the monarchy, because they just couldn't imagine a normal world without it. And the Germans, God help them, have their traditions. The Russians have their traditions. Others do it that way. But the kind of parliamentary traditions are a kind of Western thing. So if you look at Eastern Europe, which Ukraine is certainly a part of, or if you look at Bulgaria or Romania, you find countries that were essentially parts of monarchical systems. Right? They were states in which there was very limited any kind of electoral franchise, and then in the 20th century they've either lived under fascist or communist regimes. So at the end, about 40 years ago or less, they all somehow, those regimes fell, and then the existing elites, most of which were former communists in the Eastern Bloc. You ever notice that all of these sort of reformers, all of the post-communist leaders tended to be communist leaders?
Yeah, they were at one time. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's like, the glaring example of that was Boris Yeltsin in Russia. Here was a guy who was a career communist apparatchik. He cut his bones in the party. And then when the party no longer served his political interests, he turned against the party and becomes president of Russia. And then eventually passes the baton on to Vladimir Putin, who also grew up in the Soviet period, but was one of the class that didn't really found that the party no longer served their kinds of interests. And so all of that is a kind of recent import into that. And it becomes I'd argue that there's something interesting about the fact that Zelensky is an actor by profession who essentially began his political career, how? By playing president on TV.
It's pretty postmodern.
Right.
See, people saw him on TV and thought he was a good, and that's basically, I'd argue, where they voted for him, because they had no confidence in anyone else. Okay. The sort of post-Soviet Ukrainian elite, which were all these old sort of retread commies and utterly corrupt for the most part, had worn everybody out. So here's a guy who played an honest president on TV. Let's make him president. So is that an improvement, or is that a degeneration? Or you have now taken to voting for people whose only real political recommendation is that they played a politician on TV, that they are pretend, that they are the ultimate performative leader. I don't know. It's one way of looking at it.
So for us, that is also shattering the idea that our version of liberal democracy is not universal. basically, is what you're saying. Like I think that's part of it, that Russia won't accept it. The East maybe can't, function with how we think it should be, and that it's showing us that it's not universal.
Well, it never was. I mean, there's no political system which is universal or which is permanent in this case. Again, American liberal democracy, is different from all the other Western varieties. They have the main commonality to them, besides performative elections, is that they're all sort of governed by the same class, the kind of professional political class, which functions in all of these kind of. You find that in Europe, essentially, in the whole idea of it's a version of technocracy to a certain degree.
Yeah.
I mean, what we're essentially governed by is a managerial elite.
Yeah. Do you think that that people like Musk represent a new emerging elite that could overtake this professional managerial?
They could challenge the manager. The managerial elite has its basis in the institutions themselves, but also in universities.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things that Yale and Harvard largely function to do is to turn out people for the managerial elite. And we're talking about people who go into business, who go into finance, who go into law, and who go into politics. And all of those things. Yep. Yeah, and entertainment, and to combine with that as well. The entertainment aspects are kind of the jesters of this situation, which they never quite realize. They think they're important, because they have to, because they're vain and narcissistic. Otherwise, they wouldn't be entertainers, would they? But nevertheless, so they have that part of it. But you've got the institutions, the elite universities, and the institutions themselves that tend to perpetuate people coming in from those areas. That becomes, and what these people are trained to do is to manage things. And you could even see that in terms of the modern university. I worked in universities for 40 years, and the main thing, even though most of the administrators were at one point had been academics, they had become managers. And they saw the whole purpose, the whole functionality of higher education was simply a matter of management, of how to manage things, how to manage students, and how to manage faculty and other employees efficiently, and the monies that went with it. It wasn't particularly focused on it's selling something, which is the promise of a brighter future by buying the snake oil that we're selling for you here, which comes in the form of a degree. No, but take it from me, that's the way that it actually, and it's all about money, and it's all about the control of that. You got to have people graduating in order to get more money. If it's a state institution, you got to keep convincing those legislators to give you more money. That keeps the whole ball rolling. So you got to attract people in, got to churn them out, got to give them more degrees, have people might write more useless articles, so you can say that you're producing more research. Does anything actually come out of that research? Doesn't really matter. Maybe. I mean, if you don't do any research, nothing will come out of it. So think of it this way, that 98% of all the research done never amounts to anything, but the 2% does, and hence we get progress.
Well, thank you, Dr. Spence. I do appreciate you coming on and talking about all this, and it is very good to have your insights. I could honestly talk to you probably for a while longer about all this, but
I'm pontificated about these things enough, haven't I? I think I've said far.
Well,
we always like having you on.
Yeah, we do. There's so many other things that you talk about in this podcast. I do recommend people listen to it. Like I didn't even get to talk to you about Jack Parsons, which I thought was an interesting episode. Some of the insights that you had in that, things that I had never thought.
I want to ask you real quick while we're wrapping up. What do you like to call the focus of your historical studies and books. I mean, like our friend Aaron Golias, he's a historian. He hates the term hidden history, or occult history, esoteric history. What do you call it? What do you like to call it?
Well, I'd go along with that. I don't, most of it's pretty much, if it's hidden in plain sight. It's just that you don't ignore it. I think in some way I would sometimes use the term heretical history.
I like that.
Okay, there have been people who have actually branded me a heretic, even though I don't know what it is. And that's, to me, if they call you a heretic, it just means that you were probably right about something, but they don't like it. So that's it. Which is very similar to the term cynic.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that you're being cynical about something. Now, to me, that's just basically being realistic. And I've always taken the view that if someone accuses me of being cynical, they have just abandoned the argument. And they have resorted to, they're not going to try to, you're just a cynic. I'm not going to try to argue within that case. So now I'll call you what I think is an unpleasant name. So I embrace the term.
Okay.
And I would actually, and as part of my heresy, I would tell students that you can never be too cynical. Okay. And if someone tells you that you're being cynical about something, you just touched a nerve. So you should probably pursue that. And that in fact, you should not become less cynical. You should become more and more cynical, which means intelligent and in questioning about things. Just quit believing the bullshit that you're told. Yeah. Actually, pick it up, turn the turd over and see what's on the other side. Check it out. Let other people tell you what to believe.
I like that for sure.
I like that a lot.
Well, I think that's a good place to end it. We're turned over the turd. Tell people, please tell people where they can find your podcast again, and if people want to just correspond with you, and are there what subjects are coming up on the podcast?
Oh, you just froze. You still there? I'm going to continue talking.
Yeah, I'm still here.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, you can find the easiest place to find Strange as It Seems is on YouTube. And again, search for Strange as It Seems Spence, and that will bring you to you. We've got 7 episodes covering everything from what appears to be a very strange early UFO contact case in World War I Utah. Who knew? Our least popular episode, which I wish was more popular, has to do with Stalinist political school. Commie Russians killing each other in upstate.
I enjoyed that one.
In the 1920s.
I enjoyed that one, especially having read your book about Wall Street in the Russian Revolution. So I enjoyed that one as well. Yeah.
And James Shelby Downard, my favorite obsession, Jack Parsons, Aleister Crowley and his connections to intelligence and the occult. I think the weaponization of magic. And then certainly an introduction. This episode is called An Introduction to Occult Politics, which discusses Synarchy in France, the Clotilde Berson story. Coming up next is Flying Saucers and Secret Agents, which kind of rehashes some more stuff in the UFO room, looking at it from the standpoint that, well, what if this was some sort of government psyop? Or what if it was some sort of commie Russian psyop? What was really going on in some of these things? And I think that also there will be more episodes of that in some kind. And I eventually want to look at people, look at a guy by the name of Basil Zaharoff, who was one of the first billionaires of the 20th century, sold weapons to everybody, the merchant of death. You know, the kind of Bond villain that people believe actually start and perpetuate wars? Well, he's a real version of that. He's a kind of real-life Bond villain.
Okay. Well, I'm definitely looking forward to these. And these are long-form podcasts, guys, so you're definitely going to get...
well... Yeah, we could. Our idea was to try to keep them to 2 hours, but with this, we just keep talking. So I would urge that you don't have to listen to it all at once.
Yeah.
You can space it out. you can take a long, boring road trip and entertain yourself. Entertain yourself that way.
They're perfect for that, for sure. Just like our show is. So
it is, yes.
Yeah.
So,
well, Dr. Spence, I want to thank you for coming on. And guys, we are still here, still around. We're gearing up for episode 500. Patreon is still out there, though we're not posting as much on there these days. But Sergio can tell you where to find that. If you would like to support the show, send us a few trinkets our way. Sergio can tell you where to find that.
Send money to patreon.com/conspiranormal. There's a lot of material on there. I mean, I think the most valuable is the lectures we have on there from the
there's a
Strange
lot of
Reality
those.
streaming stuff. And just, as we wrap up 500 and might take things a little easier as we've been doing, just try to stay in the loop there if you want to. Otherwise, just be on the lookout for more Strange Reality stuff. I don't think we're going to have a conference this year, but we might have some events, might do some things. So just stay tuned at conspiranormal.com or at patreon.com/conspiranormal.
All right, guys. Well, thanks a lot. And thanks for listening to Conspiranormal. We will be back soon with our multi-part episode 500. So stay tuned.